Hello, and thanks for tuning in. Never Forget is a modern adaptation of a tale that's over 100 years old. This short story brings all the best parts of a romance novel into a heartwarming experience in under 20 minutes. In this tale, we meet Leslie and Maxwell, two people whose connection has weathered life's highs and lows, only to face a challenge that makes them question everything they've built together. From quiet moments and heartfelt confessions to rekindled passion, this story captures the full depth of love in its most vulnerable and tender form. Get ready to immerse yourself in a whirlwind of emotion where love and memory intertwine, and every minute counts. Whether you're a longtime romance fan or looking for a quick escape into the world of love and connection, Never Forget promises to deliver. Enjoy.
Chapter 1. Leslie sat at her desk, fingers poised above the keyboard, but her mind was miles away from the emails and reports waiting in her inbox. The office buzzed around her, a steady symphony of ringing phones, flashing screens, and hurried conversations. Normally, the hustle and energy of the brokerage office invigorated her, but today, an unshakable worry had settled into her chest. The hospital call from the night before replayed in her mind like a bad dream. Maxwell had been in a car accident on his way back from a high-stakes meeting out of town. Her heart had raced as the doctor's voice, calm and measured, explained that he'd suffered a concussion and might experience short-term memory gaps. They assured her that, with time, his memory would likely return to normal. But the doctor's words had done little to quell her worry, and now, as she sat waiting for him to arrive, the familiar hum of the office only heightened her anxiety. The elevator doors opened, and Maxwell stepped out. Leslie looked up instinctively, expecting his usual path toward her desk, where he'd spare at least 2 minutes for their morning chat, sharing a quick smile and a few light-hearted words before the day's chaos swept them up. It was a small routine, but one she had come to cherish, a moment that belonged only to them. But today, Maxwell barely glanced her way. He walked straight past her, his eyes already focused on the reports awaiting him, his face unreadable. Leslie felt a sharp pang of concern as he bypassed their usual exchange without a word. She told herself he must be preoccupied. Perhaps there was an urgent matter he hadn't mentioned yet. But something within her whispered that this was different, that maybe, just maybe, he didn't remember. Leslie tried to shake off her unease as she watched Maxwell settle into his chair. Usually, when he caught her eye in the morning, he'd offer her a small, almost secret smile, a subtle, private acknowledgement that always lifted her spirits. But today, he didn't even glance her way. His gaze remained fixed on his screen, his shoulders tense as he reviewed the stack of reports on his desk. Her eyes flicked to the sticky note she'd left him, a small routine of her own, with a motivational quote she thought he'd appreciate. He would usually pick it up, read it, and give her a faint smile before sticking it to his monitor. Today, though, he ignored the note entirely, his fingers scrolling through emails with single-minded focus. Despite the doctor's reassurances, each small break in their routine made Leslie's worry twist tighter. The accident seemed to have left a deeper impression than anyone had realized. Leslie tried to turn her attention back to her own tasks, but found herself watching Maxwell instead, noticing things she might have otherwise missed. His focus was intense, almost mechanical, as he scanned reports, gave instructions, and jotted down notes. She noticed slight pauses, subtle moments when his hands hovered over the keyboard, his gaze momentarily unfocused before he quickly shook it off and resumed working. Every now and then, he looked up, as though lost, before diving back into his tasks with even greater determination. Leslie's concern deepened. The doctor had advised him to take time off to let his mind fully recover. But of course, Maxwell had insisted he was fine, returning to work without a second thought. Leslie sighed, suppressing the urge to intervene, yet each small lapse felt like proof that he was pushing himself too hard. To help him through the day, she began filling in details on calls, retrieving files he'd forgotten he'd requested, and gently reminding him of meetings he'd already set. But each intervention left her with a new pang, a fresh reminder of the accident's toll, of the distance that now seemed to stretch between them. After a while, Leslie brought him his coffee, an unspoken gesture that had become part of their daily rhythm. Normally, he'd look up, offering her a brief thank you and a knowing glance that felt more intimate than the words themselves. Today, though, he took the cup without lifting his gaze, muttering, "Got it," his eyes still on his screen. The brief moment felt hollow, leaving her standing there, coffee in hand, feeling as though a part of their connection had vanished. Throughout the morning, Maxwell usually found small moments to stop by her desk with a quick comment, a light-hearted remark that let them share a glimpse of humor amidst the chaos. But today, he remained absorbed in his work, not once glancing in her direction, as though the space between them had grown insurmountable. The missed gestures felt like tiny fractures, growing wider with each passing hour. Later, Maxwell handed her a stack of papers, his movements brisk and detached. She took them, feeling the absence of his usual, lingering touch, the brief exchange that had once meant so much more than words could convey. Today, there was nothing, just a quick handoff, and he was back to his desk, head bent over his work. It hurt more than she'd expected. She realized now how much she relied on those small rituals, how empty her day felt without them. Each missed moment felt like another step back from the connection they'd built, leaving her heart heavy and her mind tangled with worry. Just as she was about to leave his desk, Maxwell looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a sudden clarity. "Leslie," he began, his tone soft, almost familiar, a touch of warmth breaking through his otherwise detached demeanor. Leslie's heart skipped. For a moment, she thought he might remember. Her mind flashed to the private moments they'd shared. The late nights in the office, the quiet exchanges, the way he'd pull her close when no one was around. Their conversations that made the rest of the world fade. Her thoughts lingered on those encounters. The quiet thrill of their stolen moments, when work faded into the background, when he was just Maxwell, and she was just Leslie, both lost in a world that felt like theirs alone. But as quickly as the recognition appeared in his eyes, it faded. He blinked, his expression clouding, and he shook his head. "Never mind," he mumbled, returning to his work as if nothing had happened. Leslie stood there, frozen, the brief flicker of connection extinguished as her heart sank. She realized he might not remember at all. Not the passion, not the trust, not the shared glances that had once felt so vital. The bond they'd built, the memories they'd made, seemed to slip further away, just as he was slipping further from her reach. With a deep sense of dread, she returned to her desk, her thoughts spiraling. She was left questioning just how much he remembered. Whether he understood the depth of what they shared, or if their connection had faded entirely from his mind.
We're so happy you're still with us. If you're enjoying this romance audiobook, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified whenever we release more romance audiobook stories like this. We'd love for you to join us again in the future. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and now let's get back to the story.
Chapter 2. The office had emptied, leaving only the faint hum of lights and the distant clang of a janitor's cart echoing down the hallway. Leslie sat at her desk, staring at her monitor, but not really seeing it, her thoughts lost in the day that had felt strangely hollow. The silence between her and Maxwell had stretched on endlessly, his quiet detachment filling her with a sadness she couldn't shake. As the hours had passed, each small routine missed, each gesture forgotten, her worry had grown. For a brief moment, she almost convinced herself that maybe the distance she felt was all in her head, that maybe Maxwell was just exhausted from the accident. But even as she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't deny the ache that had settled in her chest, a heaviness that only deepened with each passing hour. Then, out of the quiet, she sensed him watching her. She looked up, meeting his gaze as he approached her desk. There was a softness in his expression that hadn't been there all day, an intensity that surprised her. "Leslie?" he began, his voice quiet. "I know I've been off today. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." She managed a small smile, masking the weight of her disappointment. "I noticed," she replied, keeping her voice steady though her heart was pounding. Maxwell sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it must have seemed like I wasn't myself, and I can tell I hurt you, whether I meant to or not." His voice softened as he added, "I haven't forgotten about you, Leslie." A flicker of relief crossed her mind, but she hesitated, not allowing herself to hope too quickly. Are you sure? She whispered, struggling to keep the tremor from her voice. Because today, I don't know. It felt like you weren't really here. Maxwell reached out, taking her hand in his, and the warmth of his touch startled her. Last night, it gave me a lot of time to think. Being in that hospital, lying there alone, it made me realize how much I've been taking for granted, especially you. Leslie blinked, her heart stuttering as his words sank in. She could hear his sincerity, but something felt off, something that made her cautious. Maxwell, what happened? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. When I got the call from the doctor, they said you'd been in an accident. I was terrified. I kept thinking that something would happen, and I'd never. She trailed off, her voice caught. Maxwell's face softened with regret. I should have called you, Leslie. I should have. The accident happened so fast, and the next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, barely able to remember what had happened. I didn't mean to worry you. Leslie felt her throat tighten. All day, I've been wondering if you'd even care about us anymore. I've been terrified you'd forget us. Maxwell's grip on her hand tightened as he looked at her, his expression sincere. Leslie, I do care. You're the one thing in my life that's always made sense. All this time, you've been there for me in ways no one else has. I know I don't deserve you, but I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever. A breath hitched in Leslie's throat. The sadness, the ache, all of it hung heavy in the room between them. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Maxwell lowered himself to one knee. Her mind went blank. Will you marry me, Leslie? The words hit her like a physical blow, leaving her stunned and speechless. A part of her almost laughed, as if her mind couldn't comprehend the surreal scene unfolding before her. Maxwell, kneeling, proposing marriage to her in the dimly lit office they'd shared for years. She blinked, her heart hammering in her chest, her mind racing to keep up. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't him. It was the accident, the concussion, the hospital stay. This proposal, this grand confession, wasn't the Maxwell she knew. It was the Maxwell she feared might be left confused, grappling with fleeting memories and an impulse born out of fear. Maxwell? She forced the word out, her voice barely audible. What? What are you saying? He looked up at her, his expression filled with sincerity. I know it sounds sudden, but last night changed things for me. It made me realize how precious life is, and I don't want to waste another moment without you. Leslie, I want you by my side. Always. A surge of emotions ran through her. Shock, disbelief, sadness, and an overwhelming urge to pull him back from whatever fogged place his mind had wandered. Her heart ached at the sight of him, so genuine, so earnest, yet she knew with complete certainty that this was the Maxwell who had just survived a terrifying ordeal, whose mind was still clouded with confusion. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay calm as she gently pulled her hands from his. Maxwell, I don't think you're thinking clearly right now. His face fell, and her heart broke at the disappointment in his eyes, but she knew she couldn't ignore the truth. You had a concussion, Maxwell, she continued softly, struggling to keep her voice steady. You're still recovering. This proposal, it's not real. It's just the accident. He shook his head, his expression desperate. No, Leslie. This is real. I know how I feel. I've felt this way for a long time. I was just too afraid to admit it. The accident didn't change anything. It just made me realize what I've been too stubborn to say. Her throat tightened, and she felt the sting of tears as she looked away, fighting to keep her composure, and also struggling to fight a smile. Chapter 3. Leslie blinked, her mind reeling as Maxwell's words hung in the air between them. She'd spent the entire day grappling with the distance he seemed to be putting between them, her heart aching each time he passed by without a word. And now here he was, on one knee, his eyes filled with intensity as he asked her to marry him. A wave of emotion swept over her. Relief, confusion, disbelief. She forced herself to breathe, to take in the sincerity in his gaze and the softness of his voice. Yet, behind that tenderness, she could see the subtle hints of his memory still struggling to catch up. She felt an unexpected calm settle over her, a warm reassurance that they were still bound by something deeper. Leaning closer, she offered him a gentle smile, resting a hand on his shoulder. Leslie didn't know how to break this to him, but she knew she couldn't just stay silent. She knew she had to say something. Maxwell, she began, her tone soft and patient. We're married already. We got married last month, remember? His eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of confusion passing across his face as he searched her expression, trying to reconcile her words. She watched as the realization dawned on him, a slow but profound understanding replacing his initial disbelief. We? We did? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though he was afraid to trust it. Yes, Leslie replied, squeezing his shoulder lightly. We did. It was a quiet ceremony, just the two of us. We both agreed we wanted to keep our relationship private, even from work. It felt right, just us. Maxwell's brow furrowed as he processed her words, memories slowly resurfacing like pieces of a puzzle finding their place. He let out a breath, looking at her with a mixture of awe and relief. The tension in his shoulders eased, his face softening as he reached for her hand, holding it as though she were a lifeline. They stayed like that, their fingers intertwined, until a gentle laugh broke the silence. Leslie joined in, the sound bubbling up as they each took in the sheer absurdity of the situation. This moment was real, even if his memory wasn't quite whole. But for now, it was enough. As they looked at each other, the weight of the day lifted, and without warning, they burst into spontaneous laughter. It was the kind of laughter that only two people who shared an intimate bond could understand. Half relief, half pure joy. They laughed until their eyes glistened with happy tears, the office walls echoing with a sound that felt like a promise, that no matter what, they would find each other, again and again. I forgot, he admitted, his voice edged with embarrassment as he chuckled softly. How could I forget that? Leslie's expression was one of understanding and patience. She took a step closer, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Maxwell, don't worry, she murmured. The doctor said it'll take a few days for your memory to fully come back. He sees this kind of concussion every week, so there's no reason to be concerned. You're going to be just fine. Maxwell nodded, relief flooding him as he absorbed her words. Thank you, Leslie, he said, his voice steadying. He reached out, taking her hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. I was afraid that maybe I'd lost us, that I'd forgotten everything we had. She smiled softly, her eyes warm as she looked down at their intertwined hands. Honestly, I was worried too, she admitted. All day I kept thinking you'd forgotten our connection, what we mean to each other. Maxwell lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a soft kiss across her knuckles. Quite the opposite, he replied, a spark of affection lighting his eyes. If anything, this whole ordeal has given me the chance to fall in love with you all over again. Her heart swelled at his words, and without hesitation, she leaned in, closing the space between them. Their lips met in a gentle, tender kiss, a reunion that felt as if it erased the uncertainty and distance of the day before. The world faded away as they found solace and joy in each other, the kiss reaffirming everything they'd built together. After a few moments, Maxwell pulled back slightly, a glint of mischief in his eyes. You know, he began, his tone light, maybe I should actually listen to the doctor's advice and take a few days off. Leslie laughed, the sound warm and unguarded. Really? You're actually considering time off? She teased, arching an eyebrow. He grinned. Well, with everything that's happened, it feels like a good idea, and maybe we could take a little time off together. His gaze softened as he added, a second honeymoon, since I can't quite remember the last one? She chuckled, shaking her head in amusement. A second honeymoon? I suppose that could be arranged. They shared a warm, knowing smile, the kind that only two people deeply in sync could understand. As they stood there, basking in the lightness of the moment, Maxwell reached out to pull her close, whispering softly, I love you. Leslie's eyes sparkled as she whispered back, I love you too. In that quiet, joyful exchange, they both knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, their love was strong enough to endure anything.
Thank you for listening to this audiobook romance novel by Rebecca Best. Remember to hit the subscribe button to be notified the next time we publish a romance audiobook, and leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of this story. We look forward to seeing you again. Ready to dive into another romance audiobook from Rebecca Best? Just click the video on screen now, and I'll see you there.